Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at something that came out back in the summer, like in July, I think. That I remember somewhat being kind of big and talked about at the time, but I didn't really listen to that enough to know what exactly that it was, apart from this trilogy of movies that Netflix put out that kind of tell one complete story. Which is interesting. That I think it's one of those things that I didn't immediately go towards, despite the fact that this would normally be something I'd be really into. Is that whole thing where I just honestly can't even tell anymore when something comes to a streaming service, especially Netflix, if it's a movie or a show. Like it's as far as like advertising goes, it's so hard to tell the difference anymore, especially when it's something like this. But research was telling me something very interesting, which was apparently not only is this a trilogy of movies rather than a show or a miniseries or something, but that they were actually made for theaters, and the idea was for them to come out like one would come out a month between June and August, which would have been really interesting. I don't know that it would have been like financially beneficial to them, but like it definitely feels like the sort of streaming crowd is where this was always meant for. So that was probably just kind of a happy accident that ended up happening that way because of everything that's going on. But that would be like that is something I want to see somebody try to tackle at some point. Now that it's been sort of brought up or done again, because it's just something you don't really see that often, and so that in itself kind of makes it feel like this really unique sort of project. And like I was saying, the whole sort of you could almost say it almost has a sort of anthology feel to it, even though it's all the same story. Which, like I said, is absolutely my kind of thing. But it was another one of those cases where when something, even if it was made for theater, still when Netflix puts something out, it's always a gamble on what the quality's going to be, and usually that leans more towards not that great. And it is one of those cases, much like many things like this released to Netflix and stuff like that. There's a lot of people that seem to really, really love it and be really, really into it and invested in it, and also many that just were not and thought it was shit. And I would say, before we like actually go into them individually, I would say overall I'm probably somewhere in the middle, where I went in kind of pessimistic, but there's something in here that is interesting, that I could see somebody easily getting invested in. As far as like the execution always being there is where I'm not sure, but we'll go into all that. And I do also go into this having no familiarity with the books whatsoever. Um, Obviously, I had like 50,000 Goosebumps books as a kid, but that's about as far with R.L. Stine as I ever went. I didn't really branch out much into his other stuff, so yeah, so I had no real familiarity going into this whatsoever. So with that in mind, we can start, I guess, with 1994, which has an opening credit sequence after a pretty decent opening, and almost, I mean, it's sort of a lazy thing to fall back on, but I guess it's easy to say. It's got a Scream-esque opening, I guess you could say, where we have our uh, where we have Maya Hawke playing a particular character, and it's like, oh, when you see her, you recognize her face, so it's like, oh, she must be a major character. But no, she's only here to die in the opening, it turns out. So then after, in this opening credit sequence, I noticed one of the executive producers was Adam Wingard, which has me very interested after he did, You're Next and The Guest and stuff like that. And those have a particular sort of like taking the classic feel of like slasher movies or something like that or home invasion movies, and putting like this really like making them feel very modern in this really effective way is something he does really well. Not that the executive producer credit means a whole lot, but going in on that, like it having this modern feel despite being set in 1994, is something that does kind of feel like it clashes. Like it doesn't really feel like they really delved much into the whole 90s aspect of it. Like it does feel very modern, and the characters in it feel very modern despite that. Like every now and then there'll be a reference to technology, But even that almost feels a little more modern than it probably should, given that we're set in '94. But you just want to look at it from the story perspective and the whole, approaching the slasher genre. This one in particular, approaching the slasher genre in that sort of '90s way. It's as far as the characters go and that whole it feeling modern thing. One of the things I was put off by kind of at the start was it crossed my mind. It was like, this basically feels like some CW bullshit or something. Like it's like basically something you would see on the CW that just happens to have an R rating this time, which is, and a lot of people love the stuff that's on the CW, but coming from me, that's not a compliment. So. And obviously we're going to be pelted with like endless soundtrack, and that's something that the first two of these are going to do a lot. Is it's like this one's in '94 and that one's in '78, and it's like, how are we going to set that mood if not, other, like I was talking about, the technology is pretty much the only way they really even focus on that. They'll just pelt us with soundtrack just constantly. I feel like it's even worse in '78 than it is in this one, but there's just a lot of endless soundtrack with a lot of songs that just do not mesh. And that's basically what we're doing to set up where we are and what the tone is, I guess. But when they're not pelting us with endless soundtrack, they are using this very, very super dramatic, overbearing score that kind of undermines the stuff that it's trying to set up here. Like, obviously, we have our couple with Dina and Sam who have just broken up. And while there should be, especially when you look at the whole trilogy as like one full picture, this is stuff that's going to be super, super, like, we have to get invested in it. And the way they set up this sort of first fight between them with this really dramatic score of it, where it's just an ex-couple fighting, and it's like, in a movie like this, usually big dooming score like that means that somebody is about to be brutally murdered. But instead they're using it for scenes like this, when like the human drama of it should be setting in, but they're like kind of way overplaying it, and that's why it's convenient that it's a whole trilogy, because it does give you enough time to eventually get invested. But as far as like a jumping off point in this one, this wasn't doing like the later story any favors by the way they were setting these characters up in this very super dramatic way, where it should be, the human element of it should kind of contrast with how like over the top, like the gore and the kills and the stuff are gonna be, possession and witches and stuff like that. We get like a whole bunch of different horror aspects here, and a bunch of stuff that would typically be in its own individual story is all coming together in this one place. And it's like this. I get the idea of trying to like really set the tone and make everything super dramatic. But like I said, with how much the emotion and the characters are eventually going to play a part in this, and how crucial that is and important that is to the story, they should feel a bit like separate entities that kind of eventually come together. But I felt like there's quite a distance between the two things they were trying to set up here. Especially when they devote a lot of time to the whole dueling schools thing. Which obviously there's the whole, the Shady Side and Sunnyvale thing, and how the whole divide there is something that's seems like it's supposed to be extremely crucial throughout the trilogy, but it's kind of vague most of the time. And when we see it, like, in its present day form, when we see, like, the dueling schools and stuff like that, I feel like we're supposed to be a lot more invested in this than we are, and a lot more than what they're giving us to take into that. So the whole dueling schools thing is like a hard thing to take near as seriously as the characters do. To the point that we have this whole car chase scenario, one of these things being a school bus, and it just all feels so incredibly overblown. Like, even if that's the point, like, just tonally, it seems really off, especially with everything else that's supposed to be going on here, and how this is something that's not really all that touched on a lot throughout. I mean, it's constantly present, but as far as its purpose here, because they set up the whole thing of how this isn't literally an ancient thing, but you don't really feel that. Like, in the moment, it just feels like something really mundane and meaningless, which obviously is not the case in the story, so that whole thing wasn't really working out for me. But sure enough, this car chase, if that's what you want to call it, is eventually stopped by one of the most useless horror tropes of all time, the spontaneous nosebleed, which you will find in nearly every single horror movie that's ever existed, especially if it's got like possession and shit in it. And that's when I started to realize, like, okay, that's now that we've seen that one, something tells me that this opens the door to a lot of other horror tropes that we're gonna have. And obviously, to that you might say, if they're doing like a Scream thing or a meta thing, where it's like, well, yeah, of course they're doing the tropes, but that's to like do a twist on them or to do commentary on them or something. But there's a lot of people seem to get lost along the way when there's doing an actual trope and there's doing commentary on it, and just doing that trope without really adding anything to it has nothing to do with commentary. You can call it that all you want, but when you're just doing the thing, that's it. You're just doing the thing. So that's if that's what you want to call that. Okay, I don't know what exactly you're saying about the horror genre by just committing the same things, but all right. And we are our antagonists here. That what appears to be one antagonist at the start is this seemingly serial killer in a skull mask, which is simple enough. But we do have some scenes here that don't quite land once again because of that sort of over dramatized thing, or not even so much being overdone like with score and stuff like that, but just being there. Another recurring thing throughout this trilogy is something that's painfully obvious to the audience really early that we have to wait for the characters to realize. There's one particularly ridiculous scene where this person in the skull mask has gotten inside the house where they're babysitting, and there's a linger for a long time of this person with their back to us, kind of rummaging through stuff, and they say, like, hey, what the fuck are you doing in here? And there is a slow turnaround to reveal that it's the dude in the skull mask, and the music builds and builds like this is a really shocking thing, and it's like if you as an audience, like, okay, the characters or whatever, but if you as the audience were not aware that this person that appears to be wearing some sort of cloak with their back to us was not going to be the Skullface dude, and the big reveal was when he slowly turned around with the gigantic music, I, in that, like, if that is effective to the people that were watching this, I can see why it has, quite a big fan base also, because this is clearly people that I don't want to sound condescending, and I didn't want to go down this road, but that might be, that might easily take to something like this, where, like, everything that's going to be big and dramatic will be effective and do its job, which, good for those people getting that experience, that full experience out of this, but a lot of it just feels painfully obvious for a while. But that's not to say that it doesn't have some stuff that does start to throw a wrench in things and does start to throw interesting elements into it that we may not have foreseen going in. But, like, this first half or so is where, like, the drag is. And I did find it kind of hard to get into. They're really trying to do something with the editing, where it's like, it's really, really trying to be clever, where it's that kind of thing where people, like, start saying something and then that thought will be finished in another scene through the cut, and you can see where they really, really think they're clever, but it's kind of obnoxious more than anything else, and it's the whole showing off how cool and modern they are, but that's, yeah. And then, obviously, another thing that for some reason seems to win people over so easily, which I don't get, is just making references to other movies. And it's like how you can seem like, super cool and in the know if it's like there's a couple of Jaws references, the first one of which doesn't really make even sense, but then Fred Heckinger later says smile you son of a bitch line after they've already made the first Jaws reference. So that's the thing is like you can see that as oh it's great they have the references but that's all like references are just references like it's literally just oh he said the line from that other movie we referenced earlier. I don't really understand what that's supposed to bring to this. Where it's like sometimes you can be like, oh, it brings back the feel of those other things, but that's well, for starters, Jaws was in the '70s, and we're not out of the '70s yet. We're still in the fucking '90s, but that's beside the point. So I don't really what I'm really trying to say in this long drawn out way is I don't get the appeal of just literally saying things from other movies and how that's supposed to somehow translate to this in this really effective way and sort of like bring new life to those lines or something. It doesn't. It's just literally them saying other movies exist, and that somehow makes them like the way Scream utilized that is something different because obviously it was like the whole motivation of the killers. So of course there's going to be constant references to other movies. But here, just to say the lines and just to say the names of movies, that's I don't know. But I also didn't get like the thing I didn't get was the whole she made some sort of reference to Jaws about how it would be like jumping in with the bait or something like that, and it's like. Well, Hooper was like the human bait in Jaws, so like the bait was already human. So I don't really that reference makes no fucking sense. But whatever, unless she was talking about the chum, but I didn't give a fuck. And so talking about though the idea of stuff that like Scream did, where it's like we had multiple killers, which was something that was like totally, could throw off an audience at the time. And the interesting approach they take to that here is this idea of all of the resurrected killers, which is a cool idea. And the way we kind of start to figure that out, and they start to come sort of one at a time. And there is definitely something there, and especially the idea of the killers coming from different time periods, where it might almost be like a 13 Ghosts kind of vibe when you think about it. But they do have some interesting ideas here, and the killers do have some pretty creepy looks and designs, which are really nice. And another thing that actually stands out about this, where I was talking about like it's basically CW bullshit with an R rating, but to their credit, they do earn that R rating. Like the gore and the kills in this are shockingly brutal for the way the movie is set up. To be this thing that's for like it feels like it's for like younger teen audiences or something. The kills are really gruesome and brutal in this really effective and impressive way. Especially the sound. And some people might think the sound is maybe a bit too much, but I still kind of like that. We talked about the kill scene in the bathroom in the new Candyman and how the sound basically did all the work. And it made the scene even more terrifying. And that, like, just the gruesome sound alone works by itself. And so you might think, if that works by itself, that it might be overkill when we see just how far the gore can go. But the thing that makes that most impressive is how hard that is to pull off, because obviously at this point, audiences are going to be really desensitized to gore, and it's like especially if you have people going into this that are like huge horror fans and have seen pretty much everything under the sun, they're going to have seen just about every way you can do gore possible, and it's going to be, the more you get desensitized to that, the less that's going to really be effective. So the fact that this has kills that actually make you like cringe and want to look away is an accomplishment. And the fact that they were able to pull that off can be very impressive. And we do eventually get, like I said, it had a very rocky start, but we eventually get to a point where it does feel like there's some like enough depth to the characters to get by, and these scenes that actually work. Where like we do start to have scenes between Dina and Sam where we really start to feel the emotion between them, and when that romance kind of starts to rekindle a little bit, is when it definitely starts to. We can see where it came from, which is something we couldn't see in the earlier scenes. And then the scene where, like, Simon gives the pep talk to the brother. and stuff like that. Like it does feel like there's actual real character moments here, and they come in at just the right time. It might seem like they come in too late, but I think they were probably just in time to sort of save how we feel about the characters and the effect should we lose some of them. So yeah, and that's more or less where 94 leaves us. And then of course, we have our open-endedness to get into 78, where we get introduced to a new character who is, I think Gillian Jacobs is more or less off screen the whole time in 94, and then we actually see her in 78, where we get the teases at the end for the next one, which I just avoided because that's basically like watching a trailer, which I don't want to do. Just to get right into it blind would probably much more suit it. But so going into that, I did like the idea, because at first I wasn't sure of the idea of it being like as closely connected as it is, and as the fact that it is one full story that's eventually going to keep circling back around to where we were, because 94 was so open-ended that it's like, well, that's, I mean, I guess I could see a movie ending there, but it feels awfully unsatisfying. Like, it feels like it does need to be finished. But, because I had it in my head that 78 was just going to be just in 78, and 1666 was going to be just there. And I wasn't realizing that we were going to keep coming back to 94. And with the way... normally I would like if they were just their own individual stories in their individual time frames without coming out. But with how closely connected this story is and how it's all one story, it makes sense, and I do prefer that we kept kind of coming back to 94. Because it was almost a little too left open, so it was nice that we're coming back around to the full closure of that through the whole trilogy, so there's something there. Though, like I was saying, once again, it's 1978, so we're going to be mercilessly pelted with a soundtrack. And while they may be great songs, like I said, that doesn't mean they're going to mesh together. And it feels like a very desperate attempt to just tell us what time frame we're in, because there's not really other ways they do that. But they do take the fun approach of, now that we had a Scream-esque movie in the 90s, now that we're in 78, which is the year Halloween came out, 2 years before we got Friday the 13th. And then, like, after that's when we got stuff like Sleepaway Camp. We're going to go ahead and do the summer camp thing, anyway. So, obviously, we are going more for, like, the Friday the 13th vibe, which, is here to an extent, but we've also got, some weird stuff in here. Like, right at the start, when we see who appears to be the, younger version of Gillian Jacobs' character, she's being tormented by these kids that are, like, literally insane, that actually want to burn her and, like, hang her because they think she's a witch or something. Very extreme. We're like Stephen King would think these bullies were maybe overdoing it. Stephen King, who is often referenced throughout this, of course. And this is the one thing that's that I think this one could have focused on a little more. Is we actually talked about this recently when I was talking about My Bloody Valentine, where it's like, the Friday the 13th movies have a certain reputation for just being movies where young people are killed and that's pretty much it. But when you actually watch them, like, the entire first halves of most of the Friday the 13th movies are surprisingly character-driven. Like, they may not be, really immersive characters or really interesting characters, but we see them interacting and we get to know their relationships and who has what personality and stuff like that. Then they start getting killed. And I feel like this one could have maybe benefited from a little more of that. Like, a little more of getting to know these characters. Like, we established, like, who has bad blood and stuff like that, but it still doesn't feel like there's that much there as far as character goes. Which, much like the Friday the 13th movies, this trilogy in general is much more character-driven than it might sound, as far as when you look at the story and how it's constructed. So it's like, you would have hoped that maybe we would have gotten more into that with this one, but not really. Like, I didn't really care about any of these characters. Like, and there's some of them where we see them react pretty viscerally to deaths and stuff like that, but there's just not, for us, the audience, it didn't really feel like it was there, because I don't think we got, we established just enough to establish the characters that we kind of don't like, but then maybe we might start to like right before they die. But I feel like we could have benefited a lot more from that. But I guess you could also compliment it by saying that it starts relatively quickly, where we have the character Tommy, who eventually we know is going to be that killer we saw with the axe in '94. And to kind of see his progression to that is something that's kind of interesting, that you kind of wait to see how that's going to go, how we're going to get to that point. But it does have, like, as far as feeling like a classic summer camp movie, which you would think would be what it's trying to do, it doesn't feel like there's too much of that. Like I said, besides the, the character stuff, we do have the whole color war thing going on, but we just talked about that whole thing about, Sunnyvale and Shadyside and stuff like that, and how that all of that's pretty vague throughout the trilogy. There's even the point in time when they're getting ready to, like, rev up for the climax, and they have this big moment where they all say, "Let's do it for Shadyside." It's like, where the fuck is that coming from? But that whole thing was just. But we already talked about that. So, what is interesting about this movie that was really surprising was I was talking about how it was kind of shocking how much they went in on the gore and the kills in the first one. And what they set up here, now that we've already established how far they're willing to go for gore, they need to step up. They need to step it up in some way, so how are they going to do that? Well, it turns out the way they step it up is apparently nobody is off limits. There were some characters in this that died that I was not expecting to die, nor in the fashion in which they died. So that's, once again, you have to be commended for that. And I think another thing that actually helps here, that you would think would just be something sort of basic about the movie, is the guy that plays Tommy, whose name I believe is McCabe Sly, is his commitment to this kind of goes above and beyond what was probably necessary, and that's a good thing. Like, that's a great thing. That's going to take the sort of step that it needs to be in the territory that it clearly wants to be in. And he pretty much single-handedly gets us there. Which is, and that's the thing, is it seems like it wouldn't be that much. Like, all he has to really do is go around and axe people. But there's just a certain sort of charisma and the crazed look. Like, that's the kind of thing where to have that personality, because eventually, he's just going to have, like, a bag or whatever over his head. But when we really get to, like, see him, there is something that he brings to this certain, like, psychotic quality that really takes this to that level. Is something that's very much needed. Like, without that, like, it seems like just one small quality, but without that, I don't think this could have been as entertaining as it was. Because we do get the stuff where we're getting more of, like, the backstory, like the Seraphir backstory, and how a lot of it is the two characters in, like, the cave, which is just this very drab setting, and obviously it's the thing we talk about, how we always get to those points in very generic horror movies where it's just a long time of characters doing research. And so the scares kind of take a bit of a backseat. Usually it helps when the backstory is scary in itself, but this just kind of felt like another one of those scenarios where it's just the characters doing, like, research and figuring stuff out from the past and piecing a story together, which can be intriguing, as far as, like, bringing a mystery element to the horror. But there's not really anything done here that hasn't been seen before and wasn't really, taking it a step up. So those scenes are just, whatever they are. That's the thing I keep coming back to, though, as far as, like, is it suspenseful or not? I feel like the soundtrack kind of does it in, because I was talking about how the songs don't mesh and stuff like that, and how there's so many of them, but eventually they start getting used in scenes that are meant to be, like, terrible. And usually it'll be like, oh, the song is such a contrast, it's so weird and maybe a little surreal or something. But that's also something that's just done to death at this point, and if anything, the soundtrack was sort of killing the suspense, if, nothing else. So, yeah. But eventually we get to the point where, once again, the killers are going to all emerge. And that's something that you would think would maybe, oh, we saw that in the first movie, so it's kind of run its course now. But I think this actually helps the change in setting. Because now it kind of feels like we're like out in the woods and like just sort of seeing all the killers kind of emerge from the darkness is really fucking creepy in a really effective way. And once again, some more really brutal death scenes. There is a death scene like right towards the end here that we are seeing like really full on in a way, and it genuinely looks like the actress is being killed. It was really disturbing in a really unexpected way, and it's like the effects on that were so weirdly seamless. It was so uncomfortable to watch, and once again, absolutely a compliment. um, and obviously, this ends up setting up our little twist here, which is interesting because I didn't really put it together. Because when it started and we saw, Ziggy for the first time, um, and then we saw the older sister. It's like when we saw the other sister, I was concerned because I was like, she looks nothing like Gillian Jacobs. This is throwing like it felt like there was a disconnect the whole time because it's like this, like it, I mean, I get she doesn't necessarily have to be identical, but she so much didn't look like her that it was like I'm not even like it's keeps leaving my mind. This is supposed to be that character. So the fact that it wasn't her after all, they kind of did the frailty twist on us a little bit. Was like, okay, I don't know that Sadie Sink looks a lot like Gillian Jacobs either, but she looks a lot more like her than the other actress does. So when that reveal happened, it was like, okay, that's what I still wish I had known because I might have given the movie I wouldn't have felt as disconnected to the movie probably. But it's a reveal that worked that I didn't figure out until it was revealed. So there is something to that. So, to my understanding, this is the one that people seem to like the most. And I can get that. I don't know that I have a preference. I'm probably just on an even ground with all three of them, but I can see the appeal in this one and how it does have sort of that simplicity of the slasher movie from the '80s at the summer camp and stuff like that, while sort of unfolding the story of the witch a little more literally underneath. So yeah, but then obviously eventually that's going to take us to 1666, the Army of Darkness of this trilogy, I guess you could say, since we're going way back. And talking about how this trilogy has had some unpredictable moments, there is as far as like the whole build up to the witch and the witch supposedly being the cause of all this. It was one of those cases where as soon as we got the whole thing where Dina kind of goes back in time and is basically seeing Seraphira's life through her own eyes. I mean, surely everybody else who has ever seen a movie is right in that very moment probably had the assumption. Something tells me Seraphira's not the villain. Like just right away, like right when this starts, like right when it's revealed how we're gonna be seeing this one. We know that something else is clearly wrong. So, and people probably figured that out even earlier. But I feel like especially like when Dina takes over, it's like, okay, so clearly it's going to be she was misunderstood. This isn't actually what we think it is, and it's going to be a different villain. And then you kind of start thinking about what that is, and there's only so many characters you can look at and suspect. So your list of suspects is really small. But going into that, yeah, I do. This was another one where I had a little bit of trouble getting into it, mainly because, first off, there was the whole thing of we have all the returning actors playing basically the ancestors, and the only thing I kept thinking was, well, I get the feeling some of these people are gonna die, which makes no sense because if you're cutting off their family tree here, how do they have descendants in '94? But I don't think the movie's interested in that. So Obviously they want to establish these people are the ancestors, which clearly isn't, obvious enough by the fact that it's the same actors. So, like, half the dialogue at the beginning is just everybody saying each other's names, which is, like, really distracting and pointless. And it's the fact that it doesn't trust us to get it is a little insulting. But yeah, so once you get past roll call, basically, once this one starts, we do end up in a relatively obvious place now that we know that Dina has taken over for Seraphir. It turns out that she had a girlfriend who looks an awful lot like Sam, and then the whole witch hunt thing happened. And while that does feel very sort of predictable and obvious, I do like how much this movie surprisingly commits to the love story of it. Because I was talking about how it felt like we kind of just dove into that in the earlier movie, and we didn't really get much out of it character-wise because it was all not the execution of it and all that stuff and the way it was done. We were just kind of thrown into it, and there wasn't much emotion in it at first. So it feels like between that and the fact that we're seeing Sarah and Hannah, Hannah I think is the other girl's name. We're kind of, it feels like we're filling in a lot of blanks. Like both with the present story and this one, when we see this love story get to play out a little more. Once again, it's still not as fleshed out as it probably could be, but we've got enough of a grasp on it now that we get its placement in the story and how this is going to affect everything. Um, and the whole idea of Sam being afraid to be out in the first movie and how that's sort of something that sort of carries over, and there is something sort of almost profound being said there about the whole concept and like the whole witch hunts literally and figuratively, and how weirdly sometimes things don't change between the 1600s and the 1900s, or now for that matter. And the whole idea of that's what was keeping them apart in the first movie. Was basically Sam's inability to do this publicly and have everybody know, because you never know who's going to react in what way and all that. And we can see that it's almost like this is where that fear we're getting an actual look of where specifically that fear could come from, and how it's almost this instinctual thing that goes back centuries. And as far as the way the story is told, as far as like us being pelted with soundtrack, obviously in the 1600s we're not going to be pelted with soundtrack, so we actually get a score for once. And you can tell here that the score is probably the route they could have always gone up. I did talk about how the music was way too, big and overbearing. But this one here is definitely much more, not necessarily low-key, but as far as like telling the story reasonably without bombarding us with how we should feel or whether something is dramatic or not, as much as that. It felt much more in control and much more like it was an actual score that's actually doing its job, which is nice. And once again, going back as far as ancestors, we now have a Tommy ancestor named Thomas, naturally. Once again, I'm just really into this actor and what he's bringing to this and his total commitment to this. He does have a bit of Pattinson voice, specifically like Pattinson in The Devil All the Time, particularly in this one. But obviously there is another villain afoot in this one when our twists start to get involved. And naturally, it is... I know there's something related to... I mean, you could say just in general, good is an ironic name, of course, but yeah, this whole idea of... there's some other way in this whole history that the name good has a place here, but I can't quite remember what all it is. I wish I had furthered my research on there, solidified my research on that before I started this, but you get the idea. You can look it up if you don't already know. Yeah, so the thing about this movie, though, is it is setting up for those revelations, which is pretty much what's up its sleeve. Like, there's not much else. So we do have an hour here where the pacing isn't that great, and it feels like we're getting... Like, by the hour mark, it was starting to feel kind of long, and, like, we had gotten the idea, and there's not really been much progression apart from that. We're just kind of getting to this point where reveals start happening. But it was actually perfectly timed, because pretty much just as I started to feel that way, and just as I was like, alright, I think we've stretched 1666 as far as it'll go, is when we jump back forward to whatever, to 1994, where we get our climax, where we're back in the mall. And I do like the whole idea of coming full circle to the mall, especially since the mall, like, the neon lights thing is kind of overdone, but the whole setting of this mall was kind of working for me anyway. Um, and the way it plays, like how, they use the blood and the way it looks and stuff like that. They really use those visuals to their advantage in this really nice way. And seeing, like, all the killers emerge here, makes for a really good climax. And there's some, it's not, nothing particularly scary is happening, but there are a couple of particularly suspenseful moments. I like the moment in particular when they're making the killers follow the blood into the stores, and the brother is there, and he just, like, has to stay perfectly still while this hulking killer walks by him, where he's practically unseen because the focus is just the blood. And scenes like that play really well. And then, of course, we end on a Carrie reference, because, like I said, these references work a little better than stuff like the Jaws stuff was in the first one, where it's like they actually use it, like we were talking about the way Scream did, where it actually starts to make sense. So, that's, yeah, so as far as it completely coming together as a full story, I do think it's something, it wouldn't be anytime soon, but I do kind of want to revisit it. And now that we have a grasp on what the whole story is, because I kind of went into it. I went into 94 not even really realizing how connected and how full of a story it was going to be. And how a lot of things connect here. And there's probably more subtle things that I wasn't even catching, that might be in there also. So, yeah, but I still feel quite mixed on it as of now, where I feel like I said, a lot of the execution might be off, and there's some pacing issues here and there, and how they don't. There's some stuff they could have embraced more, but there is some stuff that I feel like they embraced perfectly, especially with how they handled their gore and stuff like that, and how the characters come to light at pretty much just the right time, even if we could have used a little more of that. But the whole thing is a very interesting project, and I feel like ultimately successful as far as being able to tell a complete story, despite trying to do it in like 3 different eras and time frames. But it does come together in a certain way, even if it does feel like there's elements that could have been tightened up a little bit or better executed. But there's something of worth here. Like I was saying, I don't think it's like, I'm not in love with it the way a lot of people are, but I don't think it's shit either, like a lot of people have. So, and like I said, I don't really have a preference as far as like between the 3. I feel like they're all pretty, like on par with each other as far as quality goes. They all have like their highs, and they all eventually, that's the thing I kind of noticed the most, how when they all started, I wasn't quite into them, and then they kind of eventually won me over in like kind of their second halves or so. 94 took longer than the others to get into, but which is crazy, because you would think it would be the simplest, because it's really just kind of doing the 90s slasher thing, but it's because it almost kind of felt like they were trying to do too much in 94, but then when you see how it all plays out and how it all connects and the large story they're telling, there's something here. So that's pretty much how I feel about these. Not like a whole lot of passion for them, but there's something here. So yeah. So we're gonna keep going. We're gonna do a versus thing next, and then the next Tremors, and then probably just a pattern of those things for a while until our next. We have we're gonna talk about Scenes from a Marriage at some point, and then we have like Halloween Kills and The Last Duel and stuff like that coming. So all that stuff. So whatever the next thing is, I think that's it for this.